Just a nurse. That's what they called her when they bothered to notice her at all. 3 years of keeping her head down, 3 years of moving through the ICU at Sacred Heart like she belonged nowhere, and it was working perfectly. No one asked questions. No one dug deeper. No one looked at the tremor in her left hand or the faint limp that got worse on double shifts and thought anything beyond tired feet. Brooke Sullivan had learned that invisibility was survival. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song as she clocked in at 11 p.m. The smell hit her first, antiseptic and something underneath it, that particular mix of cleaning chemicals and human decline that never quite washed out of the walls. She'd smelled worse in Kandahar. She'd smelled blood and sand and burning metal when the operating tents filled with casualties from IED blasts and ambushes that hit without warning. Back then her hands had moved with surgical precision through chaos. Now she applied for tape with the same attention to detail and nobody noticed. Nobody cared why her fingers knew exactly where to place a line or why she could read a patient's chart faster than most doctors reviewed them. The ICU wing stretched before her. 12 beds. 6 occupied. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythms. Monitors beeped in the darkness. One patient had been here 18 days. The new admit in room 404 had septic shock. Standard Tuesday night. She moved through the corridor checking vitals, noting fluid balances, triple-checking the medication logs because the quantities in the system didn't match the physical inventory on the shelves. It was probably nothing. Systems had inefficiencies. Hospitals weren't perfect. But her training in Kandahar had taught her that details saved lives. Discrepancies could kill. So she noted them anyway, documented them anyway, even though nobody asked her to. The supply closet on the 3rd floor was where she went when the noise got too loud. The fluorescent hum was softer there. The air was still. She stood among the boxes of gauze and saline bags and breathing room existed for exactly 90 seconds before she had to go back out and be invisible again. That's when she saw them. Combat boots. Worn leather the color of dust. Laces still tied from the last person who'd worn them. Someone had tossed them into the donation bin without thinking, without understanding what they represented. How many kilometers? How many missions? She picked them up and the leather was still warm somehow, still holding ghost weight of the feet that had carried them through fire. She almost threw them back. Instead, she set them on a supply shelf behind the oxygen tanks where nobody went. A marker. A ghost of what she used to be. Dr. Sterling arrived on the ICU floor at 11:51 p.m. Expensive shoes. Italian leather. The kind that cost more than Brooke made in a week. He moved through the nursing station like he owned the air itself, greeting the other nurses by first name, Sarah, Jennifer, Lisa, but his eyes were calculating, moving across the unit board, noting who worked which rooms, who documented what. Chief of Surgery. Titles meant things. Titles got respect without earning it. He smiled at Sarah, the blonde nurse from the day shift, and said something about her daughter's soccer game. Sarah lit up. People did that around Sterling. He had that quality. The presence that made air pressure change in a room. Brooke kept her head down, reviewing the admission roster for the night. The chart came across the unit board at midnight exactly. New admission. Room for 12. Marcus Chen. 34 years old. Former Special Forces. Spinal cord injury, T5 incomplete paraplegia from an IED blast 6 months ago. Wife at bedside. Transferred from Walter Reed for rehabilitation assessment. Wife's name, Jennifer. They'd been married 9 years. No children. The chart went on, but those details were the ones that mattered. A veteran. Paralyzed. Brought here to get better and probably wouldn't because the world had moved on from caring about the people it had broken. Sterling made his first call at 12:11 a.m. She heard him in his office, voice smooth as oil. Rodriguez? Sterling. I've got an admission coming to my floor, 34-year-old male, spinal injury, likely long-term care. I'm going to need you to take primary. A pause. Then his smile turned cold. What do you mean you're unavailable? This is your shift. He hung up and made another call. Patel, it's Sterling. I have a patient in 412, paralysis case, extensive documentation required. Can you assess? Another refusal. Another call. Kim. Okonkwo. 5 doctors in 90 minutes. Each one cited resource constraints. Each one had a surgery scheduled or an emergency somewhere else or simply had reached capacity. By 1:45 a.m., nobody wanted Marcus Chen. Brooke was placing a peripheral line in room 408 when she heard Jennifer Chen's voice rise from down the hallway. Not angry. Worried. The kind of worry that comes from watching your husband's future get smaller with every hospital interaction. She finished the 4-careful tape job, exactly like she'd been taught, the kind of detail that meant the line would stay in place even if the patient moved, and moved to room 412. Marcus Chen lay in the bed like a man who'd already died but refused to leave. 34 years old looked 90 on him. Jennifer stood beside the bed holding his hand, and she was the one who looked at Brooke with desperate calculation, trying to figure out if this night nurse was competent or just another ghost moving through their disaster. Hi, Marcus. I'm Brooke. I'll be your nurse tonight. She kept her voice level. Professional. Nobody special. But her eyes found his vitals on the monitor and held them. Heart rate elevated. Blood pressure stable for now. O2 sat at 96. All within acceptable range, but his body was telling the truth his face wouldn't admit. He was scared. She placed the peripheral line in his left hand with movements that came from somewhere deeper than training. Combat medic tape job. Same pattern she'd learned at Kandahar. Small anchoring piece above the wrist. 2 pieces down the forearm. 1 across the foresight itself. Tight enough to stabilize. Loose enough to allow circulation. The kind of work that took 30 seconds if you knew what you were doing and 5 minutes if you didn't. She was securing the last piece of tape when Marcus spoke. Quiet. Just above a whisper. That's a combat medic's tape job. She didn't pause. Didn't look up. The tape went down smooth and perfect, and when she finally met his eyes, something shifted in the room. He was looking at her hands like he was seeing through them to something behind. What unit were you with? Jennifer's hand tightened on the bed rail. She was watching Brooke now too. Watching her face for the answer that would either comfort her husband or confirm the nightmare they were living. Brooke finished securing the 4 and straightened. She could answer. She could say it out loud. Could break the ghost shape she'd maintained for 3 years and just speak the truth. But instead she looked at Marcus and simply held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Long enough for recognition to pass between them. Long enough for him to understand that someone in this hospital actually knew what he was. What he'd been. You're stable, she said. I'll be checking on you every hour. She turned and walked out and didn't see Jennifer's expression shift from desperate to something closer to hope. Behind her, in the hallway, she heard Sterling's voice on his phone again. He was calling someone else now. Someone above her pay grade. Someone with power. That was the moment things began to break in ways that couldn't be repaired. Dr. Sterling moved through room 412 like a man accustomed to owning the spaces he entered. His white coat caught the fluorescent overhead light as he held up Brooke's chart notes, the papers crisp and deliberate in his hands. Chen's wife sat rigid in the visitor's chair, her knuckles white against the armrest. Chen himself lay still, his paralyzed body a study in helplessness, but his eyes tracked every movement. Nurse Sullivan, Sterling said, his voice smooth as polished mahogany. These documentation errors are concerning. Very concerning. He let the words float in the recycled air like a threat wearing a smile. You flagged equipment charges here that were properly authorized. Multiple times. Yet you continue to question the procurement process. Brooke stood at the foot of the bed, her hands folded in front of her. The fluorescent light cast sharp shadows under her cheekbones. "Sir, the quantities don't match the—" "Are you a billing specialist now?" Sterling's interruption arrived like a knife. "Or just a small-town nurse who can't follow simple procedures?" He turned slightly toward Chen's wife, inviting her into the humiliation. "We have protocols for a reason. When staff members decide to become auditors instead of caregivers, it undermines the entire institution." Brooke's jaw tightened. One muscle. Just one. Everything else remained still. Chen's wife leaned forward. "Doctor, I'm not sure what this is about, but she's been—" Sterling raised a hand. "Your husband is receiving excellent care despite these distractions." He looked directly at Brooke, and in that moment, the room's temperature seemed to drop. "We'll discuss your future here tomorrow, Nurse Sullivan. In my office. 9 a.m. He turned and walked out, his shoes clicking against the linoleum in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. The moment the door closed, Brooke took one measured breath. Deep. Controlled. From her diaphragm, the way she'd learned on a fire base in Kandahar when mortars were incoming and panic meant death. A single tear formed at the corner of her left eye, not from sadness but from the physical pressure of holding everything else back. She wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking her composure, her gaze steady on the monitors. 1 minute passed. 2. Chen's wife stood up. "That was completely inappropriate. You should report him." Brooke turned to face her, and when she spoke, her voice came out measured and flat, stripped of emotion. "Sir, I document what I see, nothing more, nothing less." She checked his full line. Combat medic's tape job from someone in her past was still there, securing the catheter with precision that military training leaves in muscle memory. She didn't acknowledge it. She wouldn't. But she'd seen it the moment Chen arrived, and she'd known. The break room at 3 in the morning smelled like burnt coffee and the ghost of 100 overnight shifts. Brooke sat at the table in the corner, her fingers wrapped around a mug she hadn't yet tasted. The fluorescent panels overhead buzzed their endless, anxious hum. Jennifer came through the door first, Marcus trailing behind her. Tom followed. They were mid-conversation about a patient transfer when Brooke sat down. Jennifer's eyes flicked toward her. A millisecond. That was all it took. "I'm grabbing my stuff," Jennifer said to Marcus, already standing. "Yeah, me too," Marcus replied. He didn't look at Brooke. No one did that part well, the manufactured casualness of pretending a person wasn't actually a person. Tom hesitated for a moment, his coffee mug halfway to his lips. Their eyes met for approximately 1 second. His gaze shifted toward the door. He followed the others out without speaking, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft pneumatic sigh. Brooke sat alone at the table. Her coffee was still hot. She stared into it as though the answer to something important might rise with the steam, but what rose instead was just the bitter smell of something left too long on a warmer. She didn't drink it. She sat there for 6 minutes, she counted, and then she stood up and returned to the floor. The unit board was covered with morning shift notes when Sterling arrived at 7 a.m. 15 people clustered around it, reviewing the day's assignments. Brooke was checking blood pressure cuffs at the supply station 3 feet away, her back to the crowd. She heard Sterling's voice before she saw him approach the board with a red marker in his hand. "Everyone gather around," he called out, his tone suggesting this was important. Crucial. The kind of moment that would be remembered. The staff shifted. Brooke felt their movement, the collective reorganization of bodies toward the drama Sterling was manufacturing. She continued organizing cuffs. Pressure readings. Manometers. Calibration dates. Things that could be checked and verified. Improper documentation protocol, Sterling read aloud, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. He'd written it in red marker across the top of a formal write-up, Nurse B. Sullivan, corrective action required. A concerning pattern of overstepping scope of practice. Judgment issues that jeopardize patient care and institutional compliance. Brooke's hands kept moving. Cuff. Check. Set. Next. Her breathing remained steady. She could feel the gazes of her colleagues sliding across her back like water that might have been sympathy or might have been fear that her problems could somehow be contagious. This is a courtesy notification, Sterling continued, that corrective action is being initiated. Future violations will result in immediate suspension pending investigation. The word investigation hung in the air like something toxic. Corrosive. The kind of word that ended careers, not conversations. He lowered the paper. Any questions? No one spoke. The silence had weight. Brooke finally turned around, and what she saw was a room full of people very carefully not looking at her. What they didn't know was that 5 hours from now, everything they thought they understood about power would be rewritten. Brooke returned to room 412 at 9:30 a.m. Chen was resting, but barely. His breathing seemed shallow. His neck veins looked distended in a way they hadn't been during the night shift. She checked his blood pressure manually, and the systolic number made something in her recognition system fire. She palpated his radial pulse. Weak. Thready. Diminishing. The monitors showed it too, if you knew how to read the conversation between vital signs. Low normal blood pressure. Heart rate compensating. Oxygen saturation starting to drift. The kind of downward trend that moved slowly at first and then, without warning, became a cliff. Muffled heart sounds. She moved her stethoscope across his chest to confirm. The lubbed-up rhythm sounded distant, dampened, like a heartbeat heard through water. Brooke reached for the phone. She called Dr. Sterling's office first. His assistant transferred her to his surgical fellow. Room for 12, I'm concerned about, Brooke said. Resource constraints, the fellow interrupted. Transfer him to the VA. They have capacity. The line went dead. She tried Dr. Rodriguez in cardiology next. His voicemail announced he was in clinic. The answering service took a message. No callback came. Dr. Patel's line rang twice. An assistant answered. Dr. Patel is unavailable. Try another attending. Dr. Kim's voicemail was full. No option to leave a message. When she finally reached Dr. Okonkwo in emergency medicine, his response arrived like something final. He's not my patient, Nurse Sullivan. Not my problem. She hung up the phone and looked at her hands. They were steady. They'd held worse situations in worse conditions. Kandahar. Sanjan Valley. FOB Shank when the medevac was delayed and you had to move 3 wounded from an IED strike up 2 flights of stairs while rounds came in from the eastern compounds. Hands that had stopped bleeding. Hands that had held life together while everything around you was breaking. Chen's blood pressure dropped to 70/42. His wife gripped Brooke's arm. Please, she said. Someone has to help him. Brooke nodded once. She'd already decided. She was already moving. She pulled the ultrasound machine over, the portable one, the old one with a slightly cracked screen but a transducer that still worked. She squeezed conductive gel onto his chest and pressed the probe down, reading the image as it appeared on the screen like a truth no one else had bothered to uncover. Fluid. Dark fluid filling the pericardial sac. Cardiac tamponade. The fluid was compressing his heart, preventing it from filling properly, crushing the life out of him 1 milliliter at a time. She looked up at his wife. I need you to step back. Now. It wasn't a request. Chen watched her from the bed, and something moved behind his eyes, recognition, maybe. Or the clarity that comes from understanding you're watching someone remember who they actually are. Brooke pulled out a spinal needle. 18 gauge. She didn't have time for ultrasound guidance, so she didn't use it. She palped the landmarks by touch instead, finding the notch where the clavicle met the sternum, measuring down, calculating angles the way fingers learned to do when there was no time for machines. What unit were you with? Chen's voice came out as barely a whisper. Brooke didn't answer. She prepped his chest with betadine and positioned the needle. The monitor screamed. O2 sat at 67. Heart rate climbing past 140. Blood pressure holding at 70 but not for long. She pushed the needle toward his heart as if she had all the time in the world. As if her hands didn't know exactly how many seconds remained before the muscle stopped beating altogether. And that's when everything changed. 5 hours. That was the window Chen had left. His blood pressure had been sliding downward for the past 40 minutes, not dramatically, not the kind of crash that triggered alarms, but the kind that experienced nurses recognize as a clock counting backward. Brooke saw it first in the way his breathing had shifted. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, steady and oblivious, but his chest wasn't rising the way it should. His neck veins had begun to distend, swollen like they were trying to escape his skin. Muffled heart sounds on auscultation. Distended jugular venous pressure. Falling blood pressure in a patient with no active bleeding sites. The classic triad of cardiac tamponade, the pericardial sac, that thin membrane surrounding his heart, had filled with fluid from a missed internal bleed. The 5 doctors who'd refused him earlier would make that refusal permanent now. She reached for the overhead paging system at 2:08 a.m. Her voice came out steady, clinical, the voice of someone who wasn't burning from the inside. Dr. Sterling to the ICU. Paging Dr. Rodriguez, Dr. Patel, Dr. Kim, Dr. Okonkwo. ICU, room for 12. Stat. She waited 60 seconds. Then she paged again. The unit was moving slow, thick with midnight quiet. Only 2 night nurses on the floor, both in rooms at the opposite end. The fluorescent lights buzzed their usual song. Nobody answered. She tried their cells, voicemail, everyone. She tried the on-call operator. Dr. Sterling isn't accepting pages at this time. Not accepting. As if he'd made a choice. As if he was waiting for this moment. Chen's O2 sat was drifting down, 94, 92, 91. His systolic pressure had fallen to 82. The kind of numbers that didn't tolerate waiting. Brooke had performed 347 emergency procedures in Kandahar, and her hands knew the weight of each one. She'd learned pericardiocentesis on a Marine with shrapnel that had nicked the pericardium, learned it with mortar rounds walking closer with each impact, learned it with her hand steady because steady was the only option when someone's heart was drowning in its own sac. This was different, no gunfire, no sand in the wounds, no blood spray from rounds hitting concrete. This was quieter. This made it harder. She pulled the procedure kit from the crash cart. Spinal needle. Syringe. Sterile field. Her movements had that quality that came only from muscle memory reaching backward through years, not rushed, not tentative, but the fluid precision of someone whose body had already survived the worst. She prepped Chen's chest with chlorhexidine, the smell of antiseptic sharp in the small room. His wife stood near the corner, her hand over her mouth. "What are you doing?" Chen's wife whispered. "Shouldn't there be a doctor?" "There are no doctors available," Brooke said. Her voice didn't crack. "His heart is filling with blood. If I don't drain it in the next few minutes, his heart stops. And if his heart stops, I can't bring him back. So this is what's happening." It wasn't a request. It wasn't a question seeking permission. It was a statement of fact from someone who understood the mathematics of dying. She found the xiphoid process, that small bone at the base of his sternum, and angled the needle up toward his left shoulder at 45 degrees, the approach she'd used in tents with fluorescent lights running on generators. The needle advanced through skin, through subcutaneous tissue, through muscle. She felt for resistance, for the moment the tip would contact the pericardial sac. Her hands moved with the terrible fluid precision of apex predators. Millimeter by millimeter. No hesitation. No tremor. Just the geometry of saving a life. Chen's eyes were fixed on her hands. His breath came in short gasps, the kind of breathing that happened when the body understood it wasn't getting enough oxygen, wasn't getting enough anything. She was 3 millimeters from the membrane when his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. Not in panic, in recognition. His grip was strong, stronger than a paralyzed man's grip should have been. Muscle memory had met muscle memory. He was looking at her hands, at the precise way they moved, at the tape job on her other wrist where she'd secured a tape job that only combat medics made. A specific weave, a specific tension, learned in the field and never forgotten. His eyes locked on hers for 1/2 second. "Senior Chief," he whispered. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her focus was absolute. She advanced the needle 1 final millimeter and felt the give, the subtle pop of the pericardial membrane breaking. She pulled back on the syringe plunger and dark blood filled the chamber. Not bright red. Not the color of arterial blood. The dark, almost black blood of pooled fluid that had been accumulating for hours. 50 milliliters came out. Then 75. Then 100. Chen's O2 sat climbed. 93, 95. 97, his blood pressure rose with each milliliter she withdrew, 80 fiftieths, then 90 sixtieths, then 165. The rhythm returning. The pressure returning. The mathematics of dying reversing themselves in real time because one person had the training and the will to act. She finished the procedure with a final 2 milliliters of fluid and withdrew the needle. Chen's wife was crying now, her hand over her mouth, watching something she didn't understand but understood completely, the moment between death and continuation, the needle point that balanced between them. Brooke documented everything with the precision that had kept her alive in Kandahar. Time of deterioration. Exact vitals every 2 minutes. The moment she recognized cardiac tamponade. The 4 calls she'd made to doctors. The times of those calls. The fact that all 5 physicians were unavailable, Sterling, Rodriguez, Patel, Kim, or Okonkwo, all 4 names, all exact times. The procedure itself, needle advancement, resistance point, pericardial sac penetration, fluid color and volume. 112 milliliters of serosanguineous fluid. The response. Chen's vitals post-procedure. The clinical justification for the action, immediate life threat. No physician available to intervene. Patient would have experienced cardiac arrest within minutes absent emergency decompression. Procedure indicated, performed, documented. She wrote it all down like she was building a wall, each detail a brick, knowing that this documentation would either save her or bury her, knowing that Sterling would already be making calls, knowing that the night had shifted into something different the moment she'd advanced that needle without a doctor's signature on a chart. But that wasn't the worst part. The paging system overhead remained silent. No responses. No acknowledgement. Just the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the sound of the ventilator wheeze and Chen's breathing beginning to normalize. Brooke had saved his life at 2:52 a.m. on a Tuesday in Norfolk, and the 5 doctors who'd abandoned him would spend the next 72 hours systematically destroying hers. Sterling received the text alert from the ICU charge nurse 43 minutes later. He was already awake, he was always awake when something needed destroying. Unauthorized procedure. Cardiac patient. No physician order. Need to know what happened. By 4:15 a.m., he was making calls. The first 2 were to board members, men who owed him 6 figures in kickback payments for equipment overages he'd inflated and directed to his brother-in-law's supply company. I need a favor. There's a nurse on my unit who's becoming unstable. Insubordination, dangerous solo decisions, needs immediate investigation. The men agreed before he'd finished the second sentence. $100,000 buys loyalty with men like that. The third call went to the nursing director. Martha, I need you to open Brooke Sullivan's file immediately. She performed a procedure tonight without physician authorization. Cardiac tamponade decompression. She's experienced some emotional trauma, and I'm concerned she's having a breakdown. I think we need to consider immediate leave pending psychiatric evaluation. He said it like a man concerned about her welfare. Like a doctor worried about a colleague. The nursing director opened Brooke's file and found 12 years of perfect evaluations, 0 complaints, 0 incidents. But Sterling knew what to do with that. Exactly. She's been hiding this. People who crack, Martha, they crack hard. And they crack on the clock. By 7:53 a.m., an investigator from the hospital's legal department was pulling Brooke's patient records, looking for anything, a medication dose that was slightly off, a documentation gap, any technicality that would justify termination. By 9:56 a.m., the nursing director had made a note in Brooke's file, requires immediate investigation of incident from previous night. Brooke didn't know any of this yet. She was in the break room drinking cold coffee at 8:02 a.m., staring at a wall, when one of the nurses who'd left when she sat down yesterday walked in and walked right back out again. The message was clear. The unit knew. Somehow, some way, Sterling had already rewritten the story. It wasn't about a nurse saving a patient. It was about a nurse breaking protocol. Destabilizing. Dangerous. She finished the shift at 7:24 p.m. without incident. Nobody spoke to her. When she logged out, the nursing director called her into a conference room where Sterling was waiting with two hospital administrators. They didn't offer her a chair. "Ms. Sullivan," Sterling said, "we need to discuss your conduct with patient Marcus Chen. Last night, without any physician authorization, without any protocols being followed, you performed a dangerous invasive procedure that could have resulted in serious injury to the patient. The hospital is concerned about your judgment and your understanding of chain of command. As of immediately, we're placing you on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Security will escort you out. You may return to collect your personal belongings tomorrow morning with a witness." They had a cardboard box waiting. Sterling watched as she placed her stethoscope inside it, a cracked mug with a cartoon nurse on it from 5 years ago, a small plant that was dying in the corner. She didn't look at him. Didn't acknowledge the 5 names she'd written down 12 hours earlier, the 5 doctors who had refused, and then the 5 who would benefit from her removal. Security walked her to the parking lot. The rain had started. It fell in sheets now, the kind of rain that made Norfolk look like a city built on the edge of drowning itself. She stood at the bus stop with the cardboard box, and the rain hammered down like every bullet she'd stopped, like every decision she'd made in the dark, like every second she'd spent trying to be someone nobody knew about. And that's when her phone rang. The security guard's hands trembled as he walked her to the employee locker room. His name was Marcus, not the same Marcus in room 412, and he'd worked Sacred Heart for 11 years, long enough to recognize when an institution was eating one of its own. Behind them, day shift nurses fell silent as they passed, their eyes tracking Brooke the way people watch someone walking toward a cliff they can't stop. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in that sickly hospital glow, washing out color, washing out hope. The investigator had come at 3 in the morning. A woman named Catherine Wu from an outside firm Sterling had hired specifically to audit Brooke's patient records for any technicality, any deviation, any excuse. Wu had sat in Sterling's office for 40 minutes, file after file spread across the desk. Brooke had heard about it through the break room, the way news travels in hospitals, whispered, urgent, laced with pity. They were looking for something. Anything. A dose entered wrong. A chart note that contradicted another. A single moment of protocol deviation that could justify what Sterling had already decided, elimination. Wu had found nothing. 382 patient records audited in 8 hours. Not a single error. Not one deviation from standard of care. The silence that followed her report was louder than any accusation. Sterling had nodded once, slowly, and then picked up his phone. By 6 a.m., Brooke's termination was official. Now the locker room door closed behind them, muffling the sounds of the waking hospital. Her locker was the smallest one-corner unit, the kind nobody fought over because everyone preferred the larger spaces near the mirror. She'd never needed much space. A change of scrubs. Some deodorant. A photo she kept face down because looking at it too long made her hands shake in ways she couldn't control. The security guard, Marcus with the trembling hands, held out a cardboard box. It was the standard size, the kind used for patient discharge paperwork or expired supplies. Generic. Unmarked. The box that said we don't value what's inside. Brooke opened her locker and began removing items with the same precision she used in the operating theater. The cracked coffee mug came first, white ceramic with faded blue lettering, "World's Okayest Nurse." A gift from some colleague whose name she'd never quite learned, given at a Secret Santa exchange 3 years ago. She'd kept it anyway. The crack ran from the handle down the side like a lightning bolt, but it still held coffee, still poured without leaking. It was the kind of object that was more useful broken than whole, if you understood how to hold it correctly. Next came the dying succulent in its small terracotta pot. A jade plant that she'd been meaning to water for 6 weeks. The leaves had turned papery, translucent at the edges, the color of old blood. She'd bought it when she first started at Sacred Heart, some vague notion that keeping something alive besides humans might help with the nightmares. It hadn't worked. But she'd kept it anyway, kept it dying on her locker shelf like a small, quiet failure she could revisit every shift. The photo was last. 4 by 6 inches, laminated to keep it safe from hands that had blood on them half the time. 27 faces arranged in rows, all in desert camouflage, all standing in front of a building made of sandstone and shadows. Forward Surgical Team Charlie, Kandahar Province, 2011. She'd looked at this photo once a week for 13 years, never more, never less. A ritual of remembrance. A ritual of containment. Half the faces had black marker circled around them. 13 dead. 13 circles. The ink had faded but the marks remained, permanent as scars. She placed the photo in the box and felt something inside her crystallize, as if her chest had become glass and her ribs were pressing inward with terrible precision. The mug went in next. The plant. A stethoscope, not the one she used, a backup that had been in the locker since day one. 2 pens that didn't work. A hand cream she'd never opened. The box filled slowly, each item a small surrender. When it was finished, the box weighed almost nothing. "Your badge," Marcus said quietly. His voice had the quality of someone delivering news he'd rather not deliver, like a radio announcer reading about a disaster in a city he'd never been to but somehow understood. She unclipped it from her scrub top. The badge was a rectangle of white plastic with her photo from orientation, hair pulled back, face without expression, eyes that looked like someone else's. The name printed underneath read B. Sullivan, RN. No rank. No history. Just a nurse. Just a woman who pushed medication and emptied bedpans and asked patients how their pain rated on a scale of 1 to 10. She placed it in Marcus's palm. His hand closed around it like he was catching something that was falling. They walked back through the corridors in silence. The hospital was waking up, day shift arriving, families already in waiting rooms, the smell of coffee and antiseptic and the particular exhaustion that comes from overnight procedures and patients who didn't sleep. No one looked at her directly, but she felt them register her presence the way you register a weather change, something in the atmosphere shifting. A nurse being escorted out meant something. A terminated nurse walked differently. Carried herself like someone leaving a church. They passed room 412 on the way to the exit. Marcus Chen's room. Through the window, she could see his wife, Sarah, sitting in the bedside chair, reading to him from a phone screen, news, or email, or something to fill the space that medical machines created. Chen's eyes followed his wife's voice. He was alert. Breathing on his own. The cardiac tamponade resolved. The pericardiocentesis had worked, needle in at the correct angle, through the pericardial sac, fluid drawn back, pressure relieved, heart rhythm restored. He would live. He would walk again, probably. His wife would keep reading to him, and his SEAL team would visit, and eventually he would go home. He didn't know who had saved him. Not yet. Not officially. When Sarah looked up and saw Brooke in the hallway, her eyes widened. Understanding flickered across her face. This woman, this small quiet woman in scrubs being escorted by security, was the one who'd been at Marcus's bedside at 3 in the morning. The one who'd recognized the signs before anyone else. Sarah mouthed something. "Thank you." The words made no sound, but the meaning was unmistakable, was a kind of recognition that existed outside of hospitals and protocols and institutional authority. Brooke didn't stop. Didn't slow. Muscle memory took over, the same way it took over during surgery, and her body continued forward while her mind remained in that moment. Sarah's gratitude, Chen's breathing, the ventilator's steady wheeze, the small red light on the cardiac monitor that meant everything was working. The lobby doors opened automatically, sensor-triggered, programmed to recognize motion and respond. The rain started immediately, cold and without mercy, the kind of rain that fell hard enough to sound like anger. Norfolk in November was a lesson in patience and disappointment, and today it was also a lesson in what happens when you stop being useful. The bus stop was 3 blocks away. She walked toward it with the cardboard box held against her chest, no jacket, rain soaking through her scrubs in dark stains that spread like spilled coffee. The box's cardboard began to soften, the edges losing their definition. The plant tipped sideways inside, its small pot rolling. The mug shifted. The photo's corner curled upward, the lamination not perfect enough to keep out water that fell from the sky like judgment. She stood at the bus stop without shelter. The acrylic roof that was supposed to protect waiting passengers had a hole in it, and she'd positioned herself directly under it, not by accident. The rain hammered down on her shoulders and she didn't move. Didn't pull the box back to shield it. Let the water come. Let it soak through the cardboard. Let it destroy what she was holding if that's what rain wanted to do. 13 years. That's how long she'd been hiding. That's how long she'd been telling herself the nightmares would stop if she was quiet enough, small enough, anonymous enough. She'd walked away from the Navy when the PTSD became something her body couldn't contain anymore, when she'd started waking up at 0300 screaming names of soldiers who died on tables she couldn't save them from. The facility at Bethesda had tried medication. Tried therapy. Tried having her sit in dark rooms and listen to recordings of combat sounds until the fear response wore out. Nothing had worked. So she'd left. Discharged honorably, taken her disability rating, and disappeared into civilian life where no one needed to know that Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan existed at all. She told no one. Not even Jake, her 17-year-old son, who thought his mother worked at a hospital and came home tired and quiet and sometimes cried for reasons she never explained. He thought she was depressed. He thought she was lonely. He didn't know that she'd been part of a team that saved lives at a rate that made the statistics almost unbelievable. 347 trauma surgeries. 0 fatalities in retrievable patients. That was the number. That was the thing that made the PTSD bearable sometimes, knowing that it was the cost of something that mattered, that every night terror was a transaction where she'd traded her sleep for someone else's life. The box bottom tore open without warning. Water had weakened the glue, dissolved the structural integrity, and suddenly the mug fell, the ceramic cracking further when it hit the concrete, pieces scattering like bone fragments. The plant followed, the pot shattering, roots exposed to the rain, soil turning to mud. The photo fluttered down last, lamination protecting it now from something worse than water. Brooke didn't bend to pick up the pieces. Didn't scramble to save what was left. Just stood there as the bus approached through the rain, its headlights cutting through the grey like spotlights, and watched the vehicle slow, watched the doors prepare to open. Then a Honda Civic pulled up beside her, windshield wipers working overtime, and Jake stepped out holding a showbox that she recognized from somewhere deep in her memory. The shoe box from the storage unit. The box she'd thought he didn't know about. The box that held everything she'd been hiding. Jake pulled into the parking lot at 4:56 p.m., rain hammering the windshield like gunfire. He sat for 3 seconds, engine running, watching his mother stand motionless at the bus stop with a cardboard box pressed against her chest. 17 years old and already reading people like she'd taught him. He knew what that box meant. He'd known for 3 days. He killed the engine and walked straight toward her, not hurrying, not hesitant. The showbox was tucked under his left arm the way she carried things, balanced, controlled, ready. When he reached her, he didn't hug her. They weren't a hugging family. Instead, he held out the box. Mom. They need to see these. Brooke's jaw tightened. She set down the cardboard box from Sacred Heart. Her hands, scarred, calloused, capable of holding lives together, opened the showbox with the same precision she'd used on Marcus Chen's for line. Inside, 2 bronze stars with Valor. A Navy Cross. 2 Purple Hearts. A unit citation. A framed photograph from Joint Base Lewis McCord showing Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan standing with 347 successful combat trauma surgeries documented behind her eyes. 0 fatalities in retrievable patients. The record was surgical perfection. The rain intensified. Neither of them moved. I found them in the garage, Jake said. Underneath the old camping gear. You never told me. I know. The hospital board meets tomorrow morning. They're calling it a termination review. That email Dad forwarded said they were looking for a character assessment during employment. She looked at her son. Really looked at him. 17 years of hiding. 347 lives saved before that, 12 years of running before that. 400 years of carrying weight in her shoulders. Call the hospital, Brooke said. Tell them I'm coming. Tell them to have everyone present. Sterling. The board. All of them. Jake made the call while rain dripped from the awning. By 6:15 p.m., they were walking into Sterling's office. The room held 8 people. Margaret Foster, the hospital administrator, sat centered at the conference table like the power broker she was. David Chen, Marcus's father, occupied the chair to her right. Patricia Walsh, nursing director, kept her hands folded, jaw clenched. 2 board members. 1 board member's lawyer. Sterling stood near the window, confident, already rehearsing his narrative about a mentally unstable nurse who documented inconsistencies because she couldn't handle the complexity of hospital administration. Jake stepped forward first. His voice didn't shake. My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan. The fluorescent hum seemed louder. Margaret Foster's hand froze mid-reach for her coffee. Patricia Walsh's eyes narrowed, recognition flickering. Sterling's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. The nursing director's hands moved across the desk, pulling up a file folder marked Classified Military Records. Her hands trembled, actually trembled, as she opened it. She began reading aloud, each word dropping like ordnance into the silence. 347 combat trauma surgeries in active theater, Kandahar province, spanning 12 years across 3 deployments. 0 fatalities in retrievable patients. Documented by Forward Operating Base Command and verified by Joint Medical Command. Patricia Walsh looked directly at Sterling. Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd just realized what she'd been complicit in. The door opened. A SEAL Team 3 commander in dress blues walked in, rain still darkening his shoulders. His name tape read Martinez. He'd flown in overnight from Naval Air Station Coronado, specifically for this room, specifically for this moment. His presence made the air pressure change, the way apex predators enter a space and prey animals understand, without sound, that the hierarchy has shifted. He approached the table and spoke to the board. 2 bronze stars with Valor. First one earned at Jolan District, Fallujah, 2005, when Senior Chief Sullivan performed emergency surgical intervention on 4 wounded Marines under direct fire, 3 of whom survived injuries classified as unsurvivable. He placed the medal on the table. The sound it made, a small metallic clink, seemed to reverberate. Second bronze star. Sanjan Valley, 2008. Senior Chief Sullivan treated 14 casualties in a forward aid station during a Taliban offensive. 14 treated. 12 survived. Another medal. Another clink. Navy Cross. Kandahar, 2010. Senior Chief Sullivan ran into enemy fire, deliberate, documented enemy fire, to extract wounded from a collapsed building during a joint operation. 187 rounds were fired in her direction. She was unarmed. She carried out 6 wounded. All 6 survived. The citation reads, "Extraordinary heroism in the face of enemy fire." His voice remained level, professional, but something in the cadence suggested he'd carried those 6 people in his memory for 13 years. 2 Purple Hearts. Both from the same operation. Shrapnel wounds, upper left shoulder and lower abdomen. She finished the medical intervention, stabilized her patients, and didn't seek treatment until the casualties were secure. He stepped back. The medals formed a row now, evidence not of heroism but of competence under conditions where competence meant the difference between life and death. The FBI agent entered from the hallway. Her name was Torres. She had a federal badge and a manila folder thick enough to be institutional history. "Dr. Sterling," she said quietly, "we've been investigating your billing and equipment procurement practices for 6 months. We have cooperating witnesses, 2 board members in this room who've agreed to provide documentation of the kickback scheme in exchange for immunity." She turned to the 2 board members, who'd gone the color of old hospital walls. "You've already made the right choice. Cooperate or face criminal charges." She faced Sterling again. "Senior Chief Sullivan's meticulous documentation, the very records you tried to use as evidence of her instability, became the centerpiece of our case. Every equipment discrepancy she flagged. Every billing code she questioned. Every single notation in every patient file. That was our evidence." Sterling's face had transformed. No longer confident. No longer rehearsing his narrative. The skin under his eyes sagged as if he'd aged 5 years in 5 minutes. Torres continued, "You also initiated a retaliation complaint against a federal whistleblower. That's not a hospital policy violation, Dr. Sterling. That's a felony." She pulled out a photograph. Marcus Chen's chart from room 412. Brooke's precise documentation of his symptoms, the missed internal bleed, the cardiac tamponade that wasn't caught by 5 physicians but was recognized and treated by a nurse they'd all dismissed. Your investigation into her employment was actually an obstruction of justice investigation. You've been cooperating with that. Thank you for being so thorough with your paper trail." The security guard entered, the same man who'd handed Brooke the cardboard box 4 days ago. His name tag read Martinez, D. His eyes met Brooke's for exactly 1 second. He wasn't angry. He was professional. Efficient. He walked to Sterling's desk and placed an identical cardboard box on top of it. "Dr. Sterling, your medical license is suspended pending criminal investigation." This was Margaret Foster, the administrator, and her voice carried the tone of someone who'd just made peace with choosing the institution over the man. "Security will escort you from the building." Sterling reached for the box like a man reaching for a life raft that was already sinking. "You realize," he started, his voice climbing, "you realize this hospital benefited from those equipment relationships. The revenue I brought in?" David Chen stood. Slowly. He was Marcus's father and he'd watched his son lie paralyzed in room 412 while 5 doctors refused to help. He'd watched the 5th doctor get fired for saving his child's life. "The liability you've exposed us to," David said, "will cost this institution 50 times whatever you skimmed." Patricia Walsh added, quietly, "And you tried to fire the only person honest enough to document it." Sterling moved toward the door. The security guard, Martinez, D., Commander Martinez's younger brother, hired to this hospital 6 months ago as part of the FBI operation, took Sterling's hospital badge, his office keys, his parking pass. The sound each one made hitting the desk was like closing a door. In the hallway, nurses who'd walked out of the break room when Brooke sat down now stood watching. Jennifer, the one who'd abandoned her first, whispered to another nurse, "I can't believe we." Marcus Chen stood in the ICU doorway, paralyzed from the waist down but positioned in his wheelchair with military precision. When Sterling passed, Chen's voice carried across the unit, loud enough for the whole floor to hear. 5 doctors refused to help me. 1 nurse saved my life. Remember that. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Sterling was gone, escorted down the corridor by security, his expensive shoes clicking on linoleum that suddenly felt like a stage. 2 years later. Brooke's office occupied the third floor of a newly renovated wing. The plaque outside read the Senior Chief Brooke Sullivan Center for Combat Medical Excellence. On her desk sat a photograph of 12 veteran nurses in white coats, all of them standing with posture that suggested they'd held weapons before they held stethoscopes. On her shelf sat Marcus Chen's worn combat boots. The pair she'd cut from his feet that first night in room for 12, the pair he'd insisted she keep with a whispered instruction, so you remember some fights you don't walk away from twice. The boots were scarred, salt-stained. One heel was worn down from a favored step. They smelled like desert and diesel and the kind of dust that gets into everything. Dr. Sterling taught CPR basics now, minimum wage, at a community college 20 miles from Norfolk. His empire had become a PowerPoint presentation about chest compressions and rescue breathing. His fraud trial would begin in 4 months. Patricia Walsh had implemented Brooke's documentation protocols hospital-wide. In 18 months, 3 additional fraud schemes had been caught by nurses who understood that detailed notation was the first defense against corruption. Marcus Chen visited monthly. Still paralyzed, but thriving with adaptive equipment and purpose. He spoke to new patients about the nurse who refused to give up on him. He showed them her photograph on the wall, in dress blues, hair regulation short, eyes that had seen things they'd try not to imagine. Jake was in his 2nd year of nursing school, inspired by watching his mother stand up after being knocked down. More than that, inspired by knowing what she'd been all along. Commander Martinez helped recruit veteran nurses into her program. Some came from bases. Some came from hospitals where they were working anonymously, waiting for permission to stop hiding. Brooke gave them that permission. She gave them more than that, she gave them evidence that the world could recognize them, honor them, build a place for them. Brooke stood at the graduation ceremony for the 12th cohort of veteran nurses completing her program. 12 more women and men who'd learned that their scars weren't shameful. 12 more who'd understood, in her presence, that competence was its own kind of power. She addressed them while rain pattered against the windows, the sound like applause, like artillery, like the opening notes of something new. "You've already proven you can handle chaos," she said, her voice low and level and carrying across the auditorium like a command, trauma, and impossible decisions. "Now you'll do it without the gunfire. But the mission is the same. No one dies on our table. Ever." The nurses stood. All 12 of them, in unison, as if they'd rehearsed it. As if they understood that this wasn't applause, this was a salute. That evening, Brooke visited Marcus in his home. His wife hugged her at the door. Marcus showed her his daughter's acceptance letter to nursing school. The girl was 17, same age as Jake when he'd walked into that rain with the showbarks. "She wants to be like the woman who saved her dad," Marcus said. Brooke's hands were steady now. The tremor that had lived in them for 13 years, the shrapnel, the stress, the weight of holding people together, had finally let go. The nightmares had faded. Not disappeared, but faded the way old photographs fade, visible but no longer vivid. She'd told her story. Faced her past. Found that healing didn't require hiding. She looked at Marcus's daughter and saw something her own son had discovered, that courage isn't what you carry alone. It's what you pass on. Later, in her office, Brooke stood before the shelf. She placed her hand on the worn combat boots, Chen's boots, her reminder, and looked at the photograph beside them. Herself and her platoon, the faces of the dead circled in black marker, the faces of the living standing steady. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, subscribe and share this story. And if you know a veteran carrying invisible wounds, show them, there's a place for them here. A place where their scars become their credentials. Like, comment, and join us.